So as I said, this is, I think, the institution of the Lord's Supper. This is the consolidation of the story of Easter. This is what it means to us. But we start the story on the road to Emmaus. We start the story walking away from Jerusalem, and we start the story with an anonymous person in Cleopas discussing what has happened. And it's important, it turns out, that they're walking along together. They're walking together, discussing their faith, discussing the confusion, discussing the events of the day. They are not walking in different directions. They are not running away from what has happened in Jerusalem. They are together, going off on some mission together in Emmaus. They are together, and when those two are gathered on that road, when they have come together, Jesus appears to them and is in their midst. And it's important to know that this is the reaction to Easter for them. It is not to disperse. We heard last week that the disciples were gathered in a room together, discussing what had happened. And they may have sent Thomas out, but he was coming back. Today, again, we have two disciples on the road. They are not traveling incognito. I mean, they're followers of Jesus, not disciples necessarily, but two of them. They're not traveling incognito. They're not hiding who they are. They're openly talking about the things that they have seen and trying to understand them and trying to live through their disappointment together. And as they're there disappointed, as they're there mourning, Jesus appears to them and gives them an opportunity to discuss their faith. He walks up to them and asks them what they're talking about. And they're able to explain their faith as they understand it, their interpretation of events as they understand it. And then he does the same. And it turns out he's more compelling and persuasive than they are. As they say, their hearts were burning as Jesus explained to them his story in the Scriptures. And they were moved by this stranger's presence, and I don't know if they were moved by his explication or they were moved just out of hospitality, but they were moved to invite this person they did not know to share dinner with them. And we can read about the history of the Lord's Supper, how in Paul's interpretation, that this is the commemoration of the Last Supper, which it is. And we can have the rituals that happened at that dinner, and that is good that we understand sort of what it looks like and where it came from in the events of Jesus' life. But if we want to understand why we do what we do, this is the story. Because there are a lot of things in Jesus' life we could recreate. We could try to recreate the miracle of the loaves and fishes. I'm sure some of us have recreated in one form or another the miracle, the wedding at Cana, turning water into wine. But there are many other stories, too, of encountering people at wells that we could have as our ritual. That's not the ritual we have, though. The ritual we have is this one of communion, of breaking bread together. And this is why. Because Jesus, who had been with them all along, Jesus, who had been telling them the stories of his own life, was not understood by them until they broke bread together, when Jesus' presence was revealed. In this ritual, we have a moment to reflect on our lives as Christians. In this ritual of Holy Communion, we get to understand what it means that when we are gathered in his name and when we do this thing in remembrance of him, Jesus is with us and among us. Because in some sense, Jesus is manifest when we take communion, but in another sense, we see Jesus every day. We see the message of Jesus on the streets. We see the messengers of Jesus on the streets. But until we have a time to stop and break bread and meditate on the presence of Jesus in our lives, as we get the chance to do, taking Holy Communion, reminding ourselves that we are part of one body of God's children on this earth at our table. Only when we have that moment of reflection Can we stop and think about what has happened this week and who we have seen that is a sign of Jesus in the world? This is a ceremony of reconciliation, of being reminded that we are all together in God's family, that no matter what we have done, what confusions we have felt, what transgressions we have committed, we have the opportunity to be reconciled with one another and to our God. So this is the story. This is the glory. What does it mean for us that Jesus is risen? It means that every time we gather together for communion, we can celebrate Christ's presence among us. We can stop and recognizing Christ's healing touch in our lives. We can say, as have people for these past 2,000 years, done this thing, taken this bread, sat at this table of which we are the stewards in this church. We gather together in Christ's name to recognize Christ's presence among us and to be reconciled to God and one another. This is what it means that we have an open table. All of those who wish to be here and meditate on God's presence in their life or meditate on the things that they have done that make them want to be part of community are welcome at this table. This is Jesus' resurrection in the world, even if you don't believe it. We have the table for you to say, I wish to be reconciled with God's children at this table. And if you believe it with all your heart, if you believe in the resurrected Jesus, if you believe that there is life for all of us, this is your table of victory, where you too can see Jesus just as the disciples did, just as Thomas did. So every time you break bread at this table, think of this story. Think of walking along the road, hearing the explication of the greatest story ever told, and not recognizing the messenger until you invited him to dinner with you, broke bread with him, and had your eyes opened in that show of hospitality, being reminded that you never know what miracle will happen when you reach out your hand in friendship and love. You never know who you will reach when you extend an extravagant welcome to someone who shows up on your door. Because what these disciples figured out was that in that act of blessing the bread, taking it, sharing it, Jesus himself was revealed to them. We get this chance every day in our lives, and as a church, we get this chance every time we celebrate communion. So today, as we take the bread and the wine, think about your place among God's children. Think about your place here. Think about the healing you wish to have. Think about the confusions you wish to alleviate, and meditate on them as we celebrate this joyful feast.